King Charles had braced himself for yet another challenging communication from his youngest son. What he hadn't anticipated was discovering Prince William's title positioned under a directive William had never authorized. In moments, a standard security notification escalated into a royal crisis. Harry stood outside a restricted Windsor entryway, insisting on admission to a confidential strategy session, and the credentials he displayed seemed to originate directly from the heir apparent. Then Charles noticed the closing statement. Before we explore what this truly signifies for the royal household, remember to subscribe so you won't miss any updates. Charles experienced the fury building before anyone uttered a word. The Windsor gathering had been organized to allocate upcoming royal responsibilities and shield the monarchy from disorder during a vulnerable period. The Prince of Wales was the designation belonging to the direct successor, and employing it on a directive could lead personnel to assume the heir apparent had sanctioned the command. Harry possessed no invitation. Every suggested attendance required verification through protection services and the royal household, the administrative framework overseeing palace operations. The king examined the authorization. It declared that Harry was arriving on behalf of the Prince of Wales. William had approved nothing, transmitted no communication, and remained unaware his brother was nearing Windsor. Charles tightened his grip on the surface. "Who authorized him to invoke my son's identity?" he challenged. Nobody responded. Harry hadn't merely requested admission. He had appeared wielding borrowed credentials. Outside the entrance, Harry stood his ground. He informed the security personnel that his relatives couldn't shut him out indefinitely, and maintained William's standing should defend him, not transform into another barrier against him. The guard stayed resolute, but the younger prince's tone intensified. He assumed he was initiating a dialogue. Inside, his father assumed he was defying the crown. William arrived later and studied the directive without expression. The heir apparent identified language from an earlier internal correspondence once utilized during a confidential attempt to facilitate contact between the brothers. Someone had reproduced that phrasing deliberately enough to render the authorization seemingly legitimate. His demeanor shifted from bewilderment to shock. A confidential understanding had been converted into an official directive. Charles commanded the gates remain secured. He directed personnel to investigate every communication, replicated phrase, and individual associated with the document before Harry conversed with anyone within. Then the initial finding made the emergency intimate. Harry had depended on an understanding made months prior, one William assumed had already been rescinded. As Charles pursued explanations and Harry stayed beyond the gates, the emergency ceased being a matter of admission and transformed into something considerably more devastating. Which brother felt he had been deceived initially? Behind the outrage stood three individuals bearing three distinctly different grievances. Charles witnessed a family division evolving into a constitutional threat. William witnessed his credentials appropriated and employed without authorization. Harry witnessed a final opportunity vanishing before him. None of them assumed he was the actual offender. Yet only one designation had been exploited, and only one individual would be compelled to determine whether family ties still merited protection. Charles had invested years attempting to distinguish the father from the sovereign. Every entreaty from Harry drew those roles back together, compelling him to select between personal affection and official obligation. This occasion, the threat was more severe. The Prince of Wales wasn't simply an esteemed designation, it identified the direct successor, and directives issued under that identity could affect protection protocols, official timetables, and the judgments of palace personnel. William remained isolated with the replicated authorization positioned before him. He studied every statement, seeking some harmless clarification, but the phrasing was too deliberate. Harry understood which expressions would render the directive appear official. The heir apparent gradually inverted the document face down. His brother hadn't simply requested assistance. He had exploited the credentials William had invested years mastering to maintain. Harry remained in a secured reception area after guards relocated him from the entrance. Indignation sustained him upright, but astonishment had started penetrating through. He informed one guard that he hadn't misappropriated authority. He maintained he was proceeding on an understanding William had previously established. The guard offered no reply, abandoning the younger prince isolated with the intensifying apprehension that the understanding no longer remained. Charles shortly obtained fragments of previous communications addressing a potential confidential gathering between the brothers. Those communications didn't authorize Harry's admission, yet arranged in the proper sequence, they could generate the perception that William anticipated him. The king comprehended why this mattered. A confidential family conversation had been reconstructed into something palace personnel might confuse for official sanction. William ultimately acknowledged the agonizing reality. Months previously, he had proposed Harry a discreet conversation at Windsor, but exclusively under rigorous stipulations. A discreet conversation signified a confidential discussion maintained separate from public declarations, documentation, and palace pronouncements. The proposal vanished after information from another conversation escaped the family and reached external networks. Charles approached his elder son's quarters without counselors. He stayed standing and questioned whether any element of Harry's assertion could be justified. William examined the concealed authorization, then encountered his father's gaze. "Not the element where he exploited my designation," he responded. That statement resolved the urgent matter, but it exposed an earlier grievance. To comprehend why Charles's fury became so instantaneous, the palace had to revisit the evening. Harry was cautioned never to reference William's position again. Months preceding the Windsor gates being secured, William had extended Harry one concluding confidential possibility. There would be no recording devices, no public declaration, and no palace pronouncement, just two brothers in a modest room, addressing years of accusation and quietness. But the dialogue concluded with a caution so explicit that neither individual could misinterpret it. Harry departed assuming the opportunity stayed accessible. William departed persuaded it had been secured. Charles had advocated for the gathering because he feared the conflict was no longer exclusively intimate. It jeopardized upcoming responsibilities, public confidence, and the equilibrium of the monarchy itself. William consented, but exclusively on one stipulation. The dialogue would stay distinct from official palace matters. He participated as Harry's brother, not as the Prince of Wales, the designation belonging to the direct successor, and utilized when royal credentials are officially exercised. William began cautiously. He informed Harry that family interaction might remain achievable if confidential dialogue stayed confidential and no understanding was transformed into public leverage. Harry listened, then requested considerably more. He desired the heir apparent to restore his privileges, guarantee him a position, and supersede the household personnel who had obstructed previous appeals. The atmosphere transformed immediately. William repositioned his seat backward and informed his brother that sentiment couldn't be transformed into official authority. He cautioned Harry never to exploit their confidential connection as verification of royal sanction. The prince comprehended why that boundary mattered. One erroneous assertion made under his identity could perplex personnel, compromise protection, and render personal understandings seem equivalent to directives from the successor. Harry responded with years of resentment. He stated William had inherited the standing, the safeguards, and the authority to determine who belonged. He accused his brother of concealing animosity behind procedure, a structured framework of royal regulations and processes utilized to govern privileges and official behavior. The heir apparent dismissed that assertion. He stated the regulations were defending the crown from transforming into an instrument in their confidential conflict. Harry departed with more than bitterness. According to a recorded internal record subsequently examined by Charles, he retained a printed scheduling notation bearing the designation of William's position. The notation exclusively verified that a confidential discussion had previously been contemplated. It authorized no admission and guaranteed no position. Yet months subsequently, its phrasing became the basis of the directive displayed at Windsor. Charles never realized the document had endured. William assumed every duplicate had been gathered, rendering its reappearance seem deliberate rather than frantic. The prince accessed the entrance himself. "You may address me as my brother. You may never represent me as the successor." Harry withdrew without responding. Now the identical terminology had reappeared. Charles commanded Harry brought within, not as a prince reclaiming his standing, but as a son obligated to clarify why he had violated the one limitation William had rendered impossible to misinterpret. When Harry ultimately accessed the quarters, nobody acknowledged him. Charles positioned himself behind the surface. William stayed near the opening, and the contested authorization rested between them like testimony in a proceeding. There were no assistants to moderate the terminology and no recording devices to promote limitation. Harry had insisted on a route back into the royal household. Instead, he discovered himself confronting a father whose fury had progressed beyond disappointment and a brother who would no longer support him. Harry had been permitted within exclusively after relinquishing his device and accepting one stipulation. The gathering guaranteed no restored privileges, responsibilities, standing, or upcoming discussions. Charles had selected a modest confidential quarters instead of a structured chamber because he desired his son to respond as family before the situation became corrective. A corrective judgment signified an official reply bearing enduring ramifications for royal privileges and behavior. The king positioned the authorization before Harry. He questioned whether his younger son had deliberately sanctioned the exploitation of William's designation. Harry didn't dispute it. He stated the prince had previously guaranteed him a confidential route back and contended that he had exclusively proceeded on an opportunity already established. Charles struck his palm against the surface. The sound terminated every rationalization. He proclaimed that a brother's proposal could never transform into a directive from the successor. Harry became silent. The king's fury originated from more than a violated regulation. He witnessed confidential affection being reconstructed into official authority, and he understood that permitting it once could compromise every upcoming directive issued under William's identity. William ultimately rotated toward his brother. He accused Harry of appropriating one instance of compassion and reconstructing it as credentials. The heir apparent reminded him that the previous proposal had stipulations, limitations, and no association to official privileges. Harry responded that compassion without implementation was exclusively another manifestation of dismissal. He stated William had extended anticipation, then concealed behind the position when that anticipation became problematic. Harry then disclosed how the directive had been generated. In a recorded statement made throughout the confrontation, he conceded that a previous facilitator acquainted with palace correspondence had reconstructed the structure. The assistant understood how royal communications were organized and assumed personnel would comply with the designation before challenging its origin. Charles pursued the identity. Harry declined. He stated revealing that individual would eliminate the final association, still prepared to assist him return. The king removed his spectacles and positioned them beside the document. His tone became subdued. He cautioned Harry that quietness would now represent as another selection against the family. William examined downward again. A tracking identifier materialized at the foundation of the document, connected to a dormant position record and previous royal framework that should have been terminated years previously. Harry's admission revealed the emotional deception, but the neglected record disclosed something more threatening. The attempt had penetrated deeper into the royal framework than anyone initially comprehended. Harry may have transported the document, but he didn't govern the establishment behind it. Within the monarchy, a designation exclusively maintains authority when acknowledged by the individuals entrusted to implement upon it. Charles now had to establish whether his younger son had simply replicated credentials or whether someone within the royal apparatus had established a concealed passage for him. The resolution would determine whether this stayed a family disruption or transformed into a violation of the crown. Charles maintained the supreme household credentials as sovereign, signifying the governing monarch with conclusive governance over royal functions. Yet, William governed his own position, correspondence, scheduling sanctions, and every official exploitation of the Prince of Wales' identification. Royal protection necessitated more than a recognized identity. Personnel had to verify protected documentation, authenticated contacts, and present sanctions before accessing any restricted entryway. That protection had prevented Harry's directive from transforming into an automatic directive. William experienced the transgression intimately. He informed his father that confidential clemency would signify nothing if the position of the successor could remain replicated and exploited. The heir apparent wasn't defending arrogance. He was defending a sequence of credentials that personnel depended upon throughout protection judgments, official responsibilities, and crises. Charles hesitated before commanding a comprehensive internal investigation. He understood the examination could reveal previous personnel, concealed allegiances, and the confidential connections he had previously maintained in case Harry required to contact him. Those passages had been established out of affection. Now they jeopardized to transform into testimony of vulnerability. The king positioned himself beside his principal confidential administrator as the dormant record history materialized on a protected display. A confidential administrator is the principal assistant who oversees royal correspondence, judgments, and privileges to the monarch. When Harry's identity materialized within an archived contact sequence, Charles closed his vision. The finding devastated because it associated his son to a route that should no longer have remained. Still, he commanded the investigation to proceed. The tracking identifier belonged to a transitional record previously utilized while William's household framework was transforming. It had never issued a legitimate authorization, but its previous format stayed accessible to a previous administrative subcontractor. A recorded communication examination showed that the subcontractor had contacted Harry's facilitator 3 days preceding the attempted admission. They addressed phrasing, structuring, and which royal designation would obtain the quickest reply. Charles executed the judgment without another postponement. He approved an instantaneous instruction terminating every dormant record and suspending all casual communication routes connected to Harry. An instruction was a mandatory written directive necessitating palace personnel to implement immediately. Harry anticipated punishment, he anticipated fury. He didn't anticipate his father to eliminate the final concealed route between them. The frameworks were terminated within moments. Yet, the most devastating ramification didn't materialize on a display. It materialized on Harry's countenance when he comprehended the concluding confidential passage to Charles had vanished. Harry had accessed Windsor assuming that physical attendance would initiate a dialogue the palace could no longer circumvent. Instead, every moment within stripped away another association. His casual contact was suspended. His privilege appeal was dismissed. The previous record was eliminated. Then arrived the directive he had feared predominantly. He would withdraw through the identical protected entryway under supervision, with no confidential gathering scheduled and no confirmation that Charles would obtain another entreaty. The attempted restoration had generated the contrary outcome. Charles's instruction became operational before the confrontation had completely concluded. Protection teams obtained directives to dismiss any upcoming appeal constructed on inherited designations, previous correspondence, confidential family terminology, or verbal understandings that couldn't be authenticated. William's position issued a secured internal explanation, a confidential directive transmitted exclusively to authorized personnel, declaring that nobody could exploit the prince's credentials without direct electronic verification from his present principal team. Harry received the judgment without expression. He had transported a personal entreaty for his father, but the gathering was concluding before he could display it. Indignation disappeared from his countenance and transformed into disbelief. The complete attempt had been evaluated through the erroneous credentials attached to William's identity. He had arrived seeking admission. Instead, he had rendered every upcoming appeal harder to validate. The Duke requested Charles for 10 moments isolated. His tone had diminished its intensity, but the king declined. He stated no confidential dialogue could transpire while Harry continued defending the facilitator who had assisted exploiting the heir apparent's designation. The declination penetrated deeper because it originated from a father positioned exclusively a few intervals away. Harry accessed into his garment and extracted a creased correspondence. He maintained it for several intervals, then restored it unopened. His appendage trembled as he questioned whether Charles intended to examine it whatsoever. The monarch responded quietly. The correspondence would be acknowledged exclusively through structured passages, the official procedure utilized to document and examine serious appeals. For the initial occasion, Harry's confidential statements to his father would have to traverse through the identical framework as an institutional petition. Affection hadn't vanished, but privileges to it had been positioned behind procedure. Harry ultimately provided the facilitator's identity in a recorded statement obtained before his withdrawal. The revelation verified that the individual had previously functioned close enough to William's household to comprehend confidential structuring and previous position terminology. A protection guard accessed the entrance. Harry advanced forward, then paused when the mechanism engaged behind him. William stayed within. He didn't advance forward to communicate farewell. Later that evening, Charles discovered the creased correspondence abandoned on the surface despite his declination. The official response had been transmitted, but the abandoned correspondence generated one concluding confidential evaluation. Could Charles distinguish the devastation of a father from the obligation of a sovereign? Long after the counselors had withdrawn, Charles revisited the quarters where the confrontation had transpired. The authorization was absent, gathered as testimony. Harry's correspondence stayed. For the initial occasion that day, there were no officials anticipating a judgment and no protection guards safeguarding the entrance, exclusively a father, a son's unexamined statements, and the comprehension that compassion couldn't nullify what had transpired. Charles accessed the correspondence, but he didn't examine it isolated. The king requested William to accompany him after the household had become subdued. No administrator, attorney, counselor, or protection official accessed with him. Charles rendered one matter explicit before revealing the document. Examining the correspondence would not reverse the privileged judgment. It was a personal implementation distinct from the institutional reply, signifying the official punishment already imposed by the Crown. Charles commenced examining audibly. Harry conceded that he had exploited William's designation because he assumed an appeal bearing exclusively his own identity would never contact the family. The statements didn't justify the implementation. They revealed the apprehension beneath it. Harry assumed he had transformed so powerless that exclusively borrowed credentials could compel his father and brother to acknowledge. William experienced the fury restore, but it no longer positioned isolated. The heir apparent was disturbed by the consideration that Harry genuinely assumed he possessed no expression remaining within his own family. His stated desperation clarified the judgment, but it could never rationalize it. His designation had been exploited as an instrument, and confidential devastation couldn't eliminate that transgression. Charles then conceded something harder. He acknowledged that the concealed contact routes he had maintained over the years may have promoted Harry to assume that regulations could always be circumvented when sentiments became concentrated enough. The king had attempted to defend a connection. Instead, he may have instructed his son that every secured entrance contained a confidential passage. The correspondence disclosed one concluding reality. Harry wasn't requesting an official position, restored responsibilities, or a royal pronouncement. His appeal was smaller and more devastating. One confidential gathering with Charles and William, where he wouldn't be evaluated as a delegate, a certain, or previous functioning royal. A functioning royal is a family participant who executes official responsibilities on behalf of the monarch. William acknowledged, then established his stipulation. Such a gathering could transpire one day, but exclusively after Harry acknowledged in documentation that he could never again exploit the Prince of Wales designation, palace terminology, or confidential family understandings to obtain privileges. Charles creased the correspondence cautiously and positioned it within a plain compartment rather than the official documentation. The statements belonged to the family. The erroneous authorization belonged to the Crown. By daybreak, they had distinguished Harry's entreaty from his official implementation. But beyond Windsor, exclusively the implementation was observable, and the civilization was already formulating its conclusion. The conflict had transpired behind safeguarded entrances, but its ramifications contacted the civilization before breakfast. One document, one borrowed designation, and one furious reply transformed into a national debate about allegiance, desperation, and royal authority. Some witnessed Harry as a son refused every peaceful route homeward. Others witnessed an inexcusable attempt to replicate the credentials of Britain's heir apparent. Then a solitary newspaper front document transformed the family disruption into a characterizing representation. The palace issued a concise declaration verifying that an unauthorized privilege appeal exploiting the Prince of Wales' identification had been dismissed. The identification was the structured designation identifying William as the direct successor. So exploiting it without authorization generated both a protection threat and a defiance to his credentials. The declaration also verified that royal protection procedures had been reinforced. It didn't accuse Harry of falsification, but every cautious statement rendered one matter explicit. William had sanctioned nothing. Charles observed the initial morning transmissions without communicating. The king understood the civilization would witness a monarch defending discipline, not a father who had accessed his son's correspondence exclusively hours previously. That confidential implementation stayed concealed. His clemency belonged to the family, while his judgment belonged to the crown. William experienced relief when the declaration defended his position, but the achievement bore no comfort. The heir apparent observed his connection with Harry diminished to an official competition between a powerful successor and an excluded brother. He had defended his designation successfully, yet every headline reminded him of what the family had diminished. The narrative intensified when a major newspaper materialized with the statements, "Not under my identity," printed above a representation of Windsor's secured gates. Transmitters maintained up the front document throughout live transmission as a modest assembly gathered near the fortress entryway. Some defended Harry's desperation. Others pursued that no royal association should rationalize the exploitation of credentials. A royal analyst intensified the debate throughout a recorded television portion. Harry didn't simply approach on the family entrance. He arrived transporting William's credential. The expression distributed within moments. It materialized across transmissions, digital discussions, and evening headlines, transforming a complex family grievance into one unforgettable accusation. Civilian compassion shifted again when palace personnel verified through a recorded briefing that Harry had pursued a confidential family dialogue, not a restored official position. His motivation suddenly materialized more humane. His methodology didn't. Charles declined pursuits for a harsher official condemnation. He would defend William's designation, but he wouldn't humiliate his younger son beyond the circumstances already issued. The gates, headlines, and transmissions had evaluated the occurrence from the exterior. Now, Charles would issue the exclusive conclusion that mattered within the family. Charles's concluding judgment didn't restore Harry, and it didn't eliminate him. The king declined to perplex affection with authorization or punishment with permanent animosity. Harry would stay his son, but he would never again be permitted to compel privileges through another individual's designation. William's credentials would position defended. The monarchy's regulations would position intact, and the family, though still grieved, would ultimately comprehend the limitations distinguishing confidential reconciliation from a royal restoration. Charles transmitted a structured judgment verifying that the Windsor authorization was illegitimate. The exploitation of William's designation was unacceptable, and every casual route into the royal household would stay secured. A structured judgment was an official written determination bearing the credentials of the monarch. It rendered explicit that Harry wouldn't regain automatic admission, official responsibilities, palace representation, or the authority to communicate through the credentials of any functioning royal. The king appended something distinct. Beneath the official determination, he positioned a handwritten notation intended exclusively for his son. Charles documented that the connection between father and child had not been permanently terminated. A confidential dialogue could remain transpire, but exclusively after Harry acknowledged the stipulations and recognized the devastation inflicted to William. William consented not to obstruct that upcoming gathering. The prince comprehended that clemency might one day transform personal, but he declined to permit reconciliation transform a route back to institutional authority. The position of the successor had to stay defended because personnel, protection teams, and the upcoming of the monarchy depended on understanding whose credentials was legitimate. Harry responded through a approved written recognition. He conceded that he had implemented without William's authorization and guaranteed never again to exploit the Prince of Wales designation, position terminology, confidential correspondence, or family understandings to guarantee privileges. That recognition concluded the contest over accountability. It didn't restore the family, but it prevented the repudiation. Charles then sanctioned the concluding ramifications. The facilitator was permanently prohibited from royal communication frameworks. Every dormant record was terminated. The previous protection vulnerability was secured, and no neglected format could ever again bear the significance of a living designation. Harry examined the handwritten notation isolated. He positioned the official dismissal on one interval and the personal communication on the other. At last, he comprehended the distinction. He hadn't been eliminated as a son, but he had diminished the authority to compel himself back as a prince. The gates stayed secured. William's designation stayed his own, and Charles executed his concluding selection. The monarchy wouldn't accommodate, but the father wouldn't cease affection his son. Thanks for observing. Please don't neglect to appreciate and subscribe, and we will witness you in next.